Skinwalkers, in Navajo legend, are feared shapeshifters capable of transforming into animals, often wolves or coyotes. They manipulate both the physical and spiritual realms, leaving behind terror and unexplained phenomena wherever they go. Stories of skinwalkers are shrouded in mystery, filled with eerie sightings, strange sounds, and unnatural occurrences. But what happens when love and fear collide? When faced with a sinister skinwalker, the bond between two people is pushed to its limits, caught between the urge to protect and the fear of the unknown. As love faces off against an ancient darkness, the strength of that bond is tested. The following tale depicts just that, a test to see how strong love is compared to the supernatural. Eli adjusted his glasses, squinting against the late afternoon sun. The vastness of Skinwalker Ranch stretched before him, desolate and unnerving, a mix of barren plains and jagged mountains in the distance. The isolation pressed against his skin like a weight. His fiancée, Mia, leaned against their SUV, tapping her foot impatiently.
Are you sure about this?
Mia's voice carried a hint of amusement, though Eli could tell she was masking her discomfort.
I mean, alien sightings, portals to other dimensions, shapeshifters. This place sounds like it's straight out of a bad sci-fi novel.
Eli grinned, trying to ignore the strange tugging feeling in his gut.
That's why we're here, right? To prove it's all nonsense.
He loaded the last of the equipment into the trunk, careful with the delicate instruments they brought to monitor electromagnetic fields and seismic activity. Mia rolled her eyes, pushing off the car and walking toward him. Her auburn hair caught the dying light, a striking contrast to the endless stretch of dusty earth around them.
Or, we'll find something interesting and you'll get to publish a groundbreaking study. I'll even write an article about it. Scientist and journalist expose Skinwalker Ranch.
She teased, mimicking the tone of a cheesy headline. Eli chuckled.
You'd love that, wouldn't you?
They had been together for almost 3 years now, brought together by their shared love for unraveling mysteries. Where Eli sought logic and facts, Mia reveled in the storytelling aspect, always hunting for something more exciting. Their bond had always been solid, a steady partnership of curiosity and ambition. But the ranch, there was something different about this place. Even Mia, for all her jokes, couldn't shake the unease that settled between them as soon as they arrived. Later, they set up their base near the central point of the ranch, a clearing surrounded by dried-up brush and a few stunted trees. The sun was sinking fast, the temperature dropping, and a heavy silence fell across the land. Eli glanced at the instruments, frowning. Nothing out of the ordinary, just low static hums and slight shifts in the magnetic field. But the stillness around them didn't match the quiet on the monitors.
Everything looks good?
Mia asked, walking over to him with 2 steaming cups of coffee.
Yeah.
Eli said, but his voice lacked confidence. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something felt wrong. Maybe it was the isolation or the eerie reputation of the ranch that played tricks on the mind. He forced a smile as Mia handed him the coffee.
Thanks.
As the night crept in, the ranch transformed. The vast open space that had seemed empty and lifeless during the day now felt watchful, as though the land itself had eyes. They sat together by the fire, Mia curled up next to him, her head resting on his shoulder. The sky above was a canvas of stars, brighter and more numerous than Eli had ever seen.
It's beautiful, isn't it? Hard to believe this place has such a terrifying reputation.
Eli nodded, his arm tightening around her.
Yes, quite beautiful. But there's something about it. I don't know.
Mia looked up at him, her green eyes reflecting the firelight.
We'll be fine. You've been in more dangerous places. This is just some empty land with creepy stories attached to it.
Eli smiled. though the unease gnawed at him still.
You're right.
He kissed her forehead, pushing aside the worry that had been simmering in his chest since they'd arrived. They stayed there in the warm glow of the fire, talking about everything and nothing until the early hours of the morning. Mia was drifting off, her breathing slow and even, when Eli heard it. A distant howl. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. It wasn't the kind of howl you'd expect from a coyote or wolf. It was deeper, more resonant, like the rumble of an earthquake mixed with an animal's growl. The sound vibrated through the air, sending a cold shiver down his spine.
Mia, did you hear that?
Mia stirred, blinking sleepily.
Mm-hmm. Hear what?
The howl. There was a...
He stopped mid-sentence as another howl echoed through the night, closer this time. Mia sat up, fully awake now, her body tensing beside him.
What the hell was that?
Eli stood, grabbing a flashlight.
I don't know. I'll check it out.
Mia grabbed his arm, her grip tight.
Eli, don't. It's probably just an animal. You don't need to play the hero.
Eli gave her a reassuring smile, though his insides churned with unease.
I'll be careful. I promise. I just want to see what it is.
Before Mia could protest, he was already moving toward the sound. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, but it only illuminated patches of grass and dry earth. His footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, every crunch of dirt beneath his boots amplified. The howling stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Eli scanned the area with his flashlight, eyes darting back and forth. There was nothing, just empty land, the same as before. But he knew something was out there. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. He was about to turn back when he saw something. A dark figure, large and hulking, standing just beyond the reach of his light. It was still, way too still, like a statue carved out of shadow. The shape was indistinct, but there was something vaguely human about it, something not quite right.
Hello? We come in peace?
Eli called out, his voice shaking. No response. The figure remained motionless, watching. Eli took a step forward, and just like that, the figure was gone. Vanished into the darkness as if it had never been there. His heart pounded in his chest. He spun around, shining the light in all directions. But there was nothing, just the vast, empty ranch stretching out into the night. With shaking hands, Eli turned and hurried back to the camp. Mia was waiting by the fire, her arms crossed and a worried expression on her face.
Well, find anything?
She asked as he approached, her voice tight with concern. Eli shook his head, trying to hide the tremor in his voice.
Nothing. Must have been my imagination.
Mia didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she took his hand, pulling him back toward the fire.
Let's get some sleep,
she said softly, though Eli could hear the tension in her words. They lay down together, wrapped in each other's arms, but Eli couldn't sleep. His mind kept drifting back to that figure in the dark, its unsettling stillness, the way it seemed to watch him. He glanced at Mia, her breathing steady beside him, and felt a pang of guilt. He didn't want to tell her how wrong everything felt. The morning light spilled over Skinwalker Ranch, bathing the barren landscape in a dull, muted glow. Mia was already up when Eli stirred awake, the smell of coffee filling the air. She was sitting on the hood of their SUV, her back to him as she sipped from a steaming mug. Eli stretched, feeling the stiffness in his joints. The memory of the shadowy figure from the night before gnawed at him, lingering in the edges of his mind like a bad dream. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake the unease as he stood and walked toward Mia.
Morning.
he said, trying to sound casual. She glanced at him over her shoulder, offering a half smile.
Morning. Did you sleep okay?
He lied.
I did. What about you?
Mia shrugged.
Slept fine. Though I kept thinking about that howl we heard. You really didn't see anything out there?
Eli hesitated, his eyes drifting toward the horizon. The truth sat heavy in his throat, but he didn't want to worry her.
Nah, probably just some animal. Coyotes, maybe.
Mia didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway.
I was thinking of going with you today to check the equipment. I want to get some shots for the article I'm working on.
Eli smiled, grateful for the distraction.
Sure. Sounds good.
They spent the morning checking the various sensors and cameras Eli had set up around the property. Everything was working perfectly, yet the data coming in was strangely flat. No spikes, no unusual readings, just the faint hum of static that had been present since they arrived.
So far, nothing out of the ordinary.
Eli stated as he checked the readings on his laptop. Mia snapped a few pictures of the barren landscape, her camera clicking steadily.
It's almost too quiet.
She pointed out, lowering her camera and squinting into the distance.
You'd think with all the stories about this place, we'd at least see something by now.
Eli nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. The figure from the night before flashed in his mind again, sending a shiver down his spine. He glanced at Mia, watching her move around the equipment, and for a moment he felt a sharp stab of fear that whatever was out there had noticed them, and it wasn't done. By the time the sun began to dip below the mountains, casting long shadows across the ranch, Eli's nerves were on edge. They sat by the fire again that evening, the crackling of the flames the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Mia leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder, but he could feel the tension in her body. She hadn't asked about the figure again, but Eli could tell it was on her mind.
You okay?
He asked, keeping his voice soft. Mia was quiet for a moment before speaking.
It's nothing. I feel like we're being watched.
Eli stiffened.
You do?
Yeah, I don't know. Ever since last night, I've had this weird feeling, like we're not alone out here.
She said, pulling her knees up to her chest. Eli's stomach twisted. He didn't want to admit it, but he felt the same. The ranch was vast and empty, but there was a presence here, something lurking just beyond sight. He glanced out into the darkness, the landscape bathed in the flickering glow of the fire.
I'm sure it's just our minds playing tricks on us.
He said, though the words felt hollow. Mia turned to look at him, her expression unreadable.
Is it?
Before Eli could respond, a loud crack split the air. They both jumped, Mia clutching his arm as the sound echoed through the night. It came from somewhere beyond their camp, near the tree line. Eli grabbed the flashlight again, his heart racing.
Stay here.
He said, though he wasn't sure if it was to protect her or to protect himself from the look of fear in her eyes. Mia nodded, though her grip on his arm lingered for a second longer than usual. Eli moved toward the sound, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. His breath came in short bursts, his heart pounding in his ears. The trees loomed ahead, their twisted branches reaching into the sky like skeletal fingers. The light flickered, casting long shadows across the ground, and Eli felt the weight of the night pressing down on him. Something darted between the trees fast. Too fast for him to catch with the beam of his flashlight. He froze, his breath catching in his throat.
Who's there?
He called out, but only the wind answered, rustling the leaves above. He moved deeper into the trees, his footsteps crunching against the dry earth. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig beneath his feet. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to go to Mia, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to see what was out here. And then he saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of his light, was the figure. It was larger this time, more distinct. The shape of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, but something about it was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural, like it was imitating the shape of a human, but didn't quite understand how. Eli's blood ran cold. The figure tilted its head, watching him, unmoving. Eli swallowed hard, taking a step back. His hands shook as he raised the flashlight higher, shining it directly at the figure. It disappeared. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, as if it had melted into the shadows. Eli stumbled back, his heart racing. He spun around and ran back toward the camp, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. Mia was standing by the fire, her eyes wide with fear as she saw him approach.
What happened?
She asked, her voice trembling. Eli stopped, breathless, his mind racing. He didn't know what to say. How could he explain what he had just seen? How could he tell her that the figure was real, that it was watching them, and that it wasn't human? He shook his head, unable to speak. Mia stepped closer, her hands resting on his shoulders.
Eli, talk to me. What did you see?
I don't know. I don't know what it was.
He whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. The vastness of the ranch seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening as the night pressed on. Mia's fingers tightened on his shoulders, her voice soft but steady.
We need to leave.
Eli nodded, but something inside him pulled against the idea. As much as he wanted to go, something, some force, some presence was holding him here. He looked into Mia's eyes, seeing the fear mirrored in her gaze, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had to stay.
We'll leave in the morning,
he said finally, though the words felt distant like they didn't belong to him. Mia nodded, though he could see the doubt in her eyes. That night, they lay side by side in their tent, but neither of them slept. The weight of the shadows pressed down on them, silent and suffocating. Every creak, every rustle of the wind sent chills down Eli's spine. Somewhere in the distance, the howl returned. The howl carried through the night, a low, guttural sound that twisted the air and sent a chill crawling down Eli's spine. He lay in the tent, staring at the canvas ceiling, his breath shallow. Beside him, Mia was motionless, her body tense beneath the blanket they shared. Neither of them said a word. The night seemed to stretch out endlessly, and that sound, the terrible, unearthly howl, echoed through the landscape like a predator staking its claim. Eli couldn't stand it anymore. He shifted, carefully pulling himself out of the bedroll, his movements slow so as not to wake Mia. But she was already awake. Her hand shot out, grabbing his arm.
Don't, please, just stay,
she whispered, her voice thick with fear. Eli looked down at her, seeing the fear in her eyes, and for a moment he considered listening. But that pull, that dark, gnawing curiosity, tugged at him like an invisible hand. The ranch was alive tonight. He could feel it. Something was out there, something watching, and whatever it was, it had come too close to ignore.
I'll be careful. I just need to see. I won't go far. I promise,
he said softly, though the words sounded hollow even to him. Mia's grip on his arm tightened, her eyes pleading.
Eli, something's wrong with this place. It's not safe.
He leaned down, pressing his lips to her forehead, a gesture meant to comfort her, but that did little to ease the tightness in his own chest.
I'll be back soon.
He left the tent quietly, the night swallowing him whole the moment he stepped outside. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the barren landscape. The ranch stretched out before him, silent except for the faint rustle of the wind through the dry grass. Eli grabbed the flashlight and a jacket, but even as the beam of light cut through the darkness, the sense of being watched clung to him. It was that feeling again. The sense that the shadows were more than just an absence of light. He felt as though eyes were everywhere, hidden just beyond the edge of his vision. The howl came again, closer this time. It sounded like it was coming from the west, near the edge of the property where the trees formed a twisted, gnarled line against the sky. Eli hesitated, glancing back toward the tent where Mia lay waiting, but the pull was stronger now, almost tangible. He had to see it. He had to know what was out there. He made his way toward the sound, the ground beneath his boots dry and brittle. The ranch's stillness was unnerving, a silence that seemed to amplify every step he took. The trees loomed closer, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out of the earth. Eli scanned the area with his flashlight, but the beam seemed to falter, barely piercing the shadows. The air was colder here, sharper, as though something was draining the warmth from the very ground. Suddenly, something moved. Just a flicker at the edge of his vision, but enough to freeze him in his tracks. His pulse quickened as he swept the light toward the trees. He could see it now, something large, just beyond the tree line. It was watching him. Eli's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness. It was massive, towering over him, but its shape was wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its head too large for its body. The light caught its eyes. Two glowing orbs that reflected the beam with an unnatural brightness. It wasn't human. Eli's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground, the cold air wrapping around him like a vise. The creature's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment he thought he saw something in them. Something almost familiar, something that made his chest tighten with a strange sense of recognition. The howl came again, this time from the creature itself. The sound reverberated through Eli's bones, deep and primal. The air seemed to tremble with its resonance, and Eli could feel the sound vibrating through the ground, as though the very earth was reacting to the creature's presence. His heart raced as the creature took a step forward, its massive form moving with an eerie, unnatural grace. Eli stumbled back, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He wanted to call out to Mia, to scream for help, but his voice was trapped in his throat. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature stopped, its head tilted to the side, watching him with those glowing eyes. It stood there, perfectly still, as if waiting for something. Eli took a hesitant step back, his mind racing. What did it want? Why wasn't it attacking? The creature let out a low growl, its gaze never leaving him. Eli could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him, suffocating. And then, in a moment of clarity, he understood. It wasn't here for him. It was here for Mia. Panic surged through him as he turned and sprinted back toward the camp, his legs carrying him faster than he thought possible. The flashlight bounced wildly in his grip, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting back to Mia. The howl echoed behind him, but it was distant now, fading into the night as he raced toward the tent. He burst through the flaps, panting and out of breath, his heart slamming against his ribs. Mia was gone. The tent was empty, the bedroll she had been lying in crumpled and cold. Eli's stomach twisted as he called out her name, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. There was no answer. Frantically, he searched the camp, his flashlight sweeping over the barren ground, but there was no sign of her. His chest tightened as dread clawed its way up his throat. Where was she? How had she disappeared so quickly? He stumbled to the edge of the camp, his mind reeling. And that's when he witnessed something strange. At the far end of the clearing, near the stone circle they had found earlier in the day, stood Mia. She was facing away from him, her back rigid, her body completely still.
Mia. Thank God.
Eli called, relief and fear warring in his voice. But she didn't turn. Eli rushed toward her, his heart hammering in his chest.
Mia, what are you doing? You shouldn't be out here.
He stopped dead in his tracks. Mia's head turned slowly, her eyes locking onto his. But they weren't her eyes. They glowed with the same unnatural light as the creature's. Cold, emotionless, otherworldly. Eli's blood ran cold.
Mia?
His voice was full of confusion. She smiled. Not the warm, playful smile he knew so well. This smile was thin, stretched, and hollow. It was a smile that didn't belong on her face. And then she spoke, her voice soft, but not her own.
He's here.
Before Eli could react, the ground beneath him trembled, a deep rumble rising from the earth itself. He spun around, his flashlight sweeping over the clearing, and there it was. The creature standing at the edge of the darkness, watching them both. Eli's heart pounded in his ears. He turned back to Mia, but she was already moving, walking slowly toward the creature, her steps unnaturally slow and deliberate.
Mia. Please stop.
Eli's voice cracked with desperation. But she didn't stop. She didn't even look back. And then, just as she reached the creature, they both vanished into the shadows. The howl rose once more, piercing the night air, and then silence. Eli stood there, frozen, the weight of everything that just transpired pressing down on him. His mind was blank, his heart shattered. Mia was gone. The world felt unreal. Eli stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the spot where Mia had vanished into the darkness. The last remnants of her presence, that eerie smile, and those glowing eyes, burned into his memory. The cold night air pressed against him, but all he could feel was the rising panic.
Mia. Answer me. Mia.
His voice cracked as it cut through the silence, echoing across the barren landscape. But there was no answer, no movement. Only the oppressive stillness of the ranch, stretching out like a predator waiting to pounce. The creature, whatever it was, had taken her. Or worse, it had become her. Eli's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. One moment, Mia had been lying next to him, and the next, she was gone, replaced by something that wasn't her. The howl echoed in his ears, and he could still see those eyes, glowing in the dark, watching him. He stumbled forward, his legs weak, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to find her. He couldn't let this place, this thing, take her. The ranch felt alive, a living, breathing entity, and it had its hold on her, on both of them. Grabbing the flashlight, he sprinted toward the stone circle where he had seen her last. The beam flickered as it cut through the night, casting long, dancing shadows across the ground. He searched for any sign, any trace of Mia, but there was nothing. Not a footprint, not a strand of hair. Just the twisted stones standing like silent sentinels under the moonlight.
Mia. Where are you?
He called again, his voice hoarse with desperation. Still nothing. The cold crept into his bones, and the once familiar landscape of the ranch now felt foreign and hostile. Every corner of the ranch seemed to watch him, each rustle of the wind sounding like something just out of sight, stalking him. Eli knew he couldn't wait. Whatever had taken Mia was moving, and it was moving fast. He had to track it. He had to hunt it down before it was too late. He pulled out his phone and quickly opened the GPS app, setting it to track the sensors and equipment they'd scattered across the property earlier. Maybe, just maybe, he could use the data to follow Mia's path. The screen flickered to life, showing the faint outlines of the ranch and the locations of the monitoring stations. There, near the farthest point of the ranch, the sensors were picking up something. An anomaly. It was faint, but it was moving. And it was heading toward the old barn on the edge of the property, the one no one had dared approach since they arrived. Eli's blood ran cold. The barn was where the legends of Skinwalker Ranch spoke of dark rituals, strange apparitions, and unexplained disappearances. If that thing, the creature that had taken Mia, was there, she didn't have much time. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and began the long trek toward the barn. The night felt endless, the darkness suffocating. Every shadow seemed to move, and every gust of wind carried a whisper that wasn't there before. The ranch was alive, and it was watching him. The barn loomed ahead, a decaying structure lost to time. Its weathered wood was dark and warped, the roof sagging in the middle, and the windows shattered long ago. It looked more like the bones of a forgotten beast than a building, its very presence radiating dread. Eli hesitated, the overwhelming sense of wrongness nearly suffocating him as he stood at the threshold. But Mia was in there. She had to be. And he couldn't abandon her. He stepped forward, the creaking of the barn door announcing his arrival. The air inside was musty, filled with the smell of rotting wood and damp earth. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the darkness, revealing the scattered remains of old tools, broken machinery, and something else. Something more recent. Footprints. Eli crouched down, examining the dirt floor. Mia's boots. They led deeper into the barn. The tracks were fresh, but there was something wrong with them. The stride was too wide, as though she had been moving in a way that wasn't natural, as if she hadn't been in control. He followed the trail, heart pounding. The barn creaked and groaned around him, the sound of the wind outside barely masking the sense that something was moving just beyond his sight. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. Eli's breath fogged in front of him as the cold wrapped around his body like a suffocating shroud. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he pressed on. The footprints led to the farthest corner of the barn, where the shadows seemed impossibly thick. And then he saw her. Mia stood in the corner, her back to him, facing the wall. Her body was motionless, her hands hanging limply at her sides. Eli's heart leaped into his throat as he rushed toward her.
Mia.
He called, his voice cracking with emotion. But she didn't respond. She didn't move. Eli reached out, his fingers brushing against her shoulder. She was ice cold.
Mia, please, it's me. It's Eli.
He whispered, stepping around to face her. Her head turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. But they weren't Mia's eyes. They were empty, hollow, glowing with that same unnatural light. Eli stumbled back, his heart shattering. This wasn't Mia. It looked like her, but the warmth, the spark, everything that made her who she was gone.
What are you?
Eli demanded, his voice trembling with rage and fear. Mia, no, the thing that had taken her, smiled that thin, eerie smile again.
She's not here anymore, but you can still join her.
It said, its voice twisted and distorted like several voices layered over one another. Eli's hand shook.
What do you want with her?
The creature tilted its head as if considering him.
She came willingly. She felt the pull, the same as you. The ranch calls to those it chooses.
Eli clenched his fists, fighting the urge to scream.
Let her go, please.
The creature took a step forward, its cold presence filling the air.
You don't understand. The hunt never ends here. She is part of it now, and so are you.
Before Eli could react, the creature lunged, its cold fingers wrapping around his wrist like iron. The barn seemed to close in around him, the walls shifting, the darkness thickening, until it felt as though the very air was suffocating him. But then something flickered in Mia's eyes. For just a split second, he saw her. The real her. Her lips moved, and he heard her voice, faint and distant.
Run.
With all the strength he could muster, Eli yanked his arm free, stumbling back toward the entrance. The creature, Mia, stood there, watching him, its glowing eyes filled with an unnatural hunger. The air around them seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, as if the ranch itself was feeding off their fear. Eli didn't look back. He bolted through the barn door and into the night, his legs burning as he sprinted away from the horrors inside. His chest heaved with every breath, and his mind raced with a singular thought. He had to escape. But the ranch wasn't letting him go. The shadows moved with him, chasing him, pulling at him as he fled. The air grew thicker, the howls of unseen creatures filling his ears as he ran. And then, just as he thought he had broken free, the ground beneath him gave way. He fell. Eli hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. The world spun around him as he struggled to breathe, his chest heaving with sharp, painful gasps. He blinked against the darkness, trying to make sense of what had happened. The barn was gone, swallowed by the night. The ground had given way beneath his feet, and now he was somewhere else, somewhere far below the surface of the ranch. His flashlight lay several feet away, flickering weakly, its beam casting eerie, jagged shadows on the uneven walls of the pit he had fallen into. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. His head throbbed, and every inch of his body ached from the fall. But none of that mattered. All he could think about was Mia. She was still out there, trapped in whatever twisted force had taken control of her. Eli's mind raced, replaying the last moments in the barn, her face and her voice distorted by the thing inside her. But then there had been that flicker, that brief moment when the real Mia had shone through, telling him to run. She was still in there, somewhere buried beneath the ranch's curse. He had to find her. He had to save her. Eli forced himself to his feet, gritting his teeth against the pain. He stumbled over to the flashlight, picking it up and sweeping the light around the space he had fallen into. It wasn't just a pit. It was a tunnel, a rough, jagged path carved deep into the earth, leading further into the unknown depths beneath the ranch. The flashlight flickered again, threatening to die completely, but Eli pressed forward. The tunnel walls seemed to close in on him, the oppressive weight of the earth above making it difficult to breathe. As he moved deeper into the tunnel, the air grew colder, and the sensation of being watched returned, stronger than ever. The ranch had led him here. It had drawn him in. Whatever was beneath the surface, it was where the truth lay, where Mia had been taken, where everything would finally make sense. He just hoped he wasn't too late. The tunnel stretched on for what felt like hours, the path narrowing and twisting as it descended deeper into the earth. Eli's hands were scraped and raw from the jagged rocks, but he didn't stop. The further he went, the more the darkness seemed to press in on him, like a living thing that hungered for his fear. And then finally he saw it. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, the ceiling so high that the weak beam of his flashlight barely touched it. The walls were lined with strange markings, symbols that pulsed with a faint, eerie light. At the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, old and weathered, its surface slick with a dark, viscous liquid that gleamed in the dim light. And standing beside the altar was Mia. She was facing away from him, her figure silhouetted against the unnatural glow of the chamber. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her arms were limp at her sides. She didn't move. She didn't acknowledge his presence. Eli's heart clenched in his chest.
Mia?
His voice echoed through the chamber. She turned slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural. When she faced him, Eli's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes, once warm and full of life, were now black, empty voids, swirling with an otherworldly light. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her expression was one of cold detachment, as though she didn't recognize him.
Mia, it's me.
Eli said, his voice trembling.
You have to fight it. Whatever this is, you have to come back to me.
She took a step forward, and Eli felt his heart lurch. There was something deeply wrong in the way she moved, as if her body was being controlled by invisible strings, pulled by some force beyond her will.
You shouldn't have come,
she said, her voice low and hollow. It wasn't Mia's voice. It was the creature's. Eli took a step closer, his hands trembling.
I came for you. I won't leave you here.
Her head tilted, that same eerie smile creeping across her lips.
There's no leaving, Eli. Not now. Not ever.
The chamber seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing heavier with each passing second. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and the ground beneath Eli's feet began to tremble. He glanced around, his heart pounding in his chest. The ranch was alive, feeding off their fear, drawing them deeper into its grasp. Eli pleaded.
You have to fight it, Mia. I know you're still in there.
For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Something familiar. The darkness seemed to waver, and Eli saw a glimpse of the woman he loved, trapped beneath the surface.
Eli.
Her voice was faint, but it was her voice this time. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out toward him, her face softening. Eli's heart leaped with hope. He rushed toward her, his hands outstretched, ready to pull her away from the altar, away from the curse that had consumed her. But just as their fingers brushed, the chamber shook violently, and the darkness surged back into her eyes. Mia's expression twisted, the cold, hollow smile returning as she recoiled from his touch.
It's too late. She belongs to us now.
Eli's heart shattered.
No, I won't let you take her.
The ground beneath the altar began to split open, a deep fissure forming as the energy in the chamber reached a fever pitch. The symbols on the walls flared to life, and a low, guttural howl echoed through the air, reverberating through Eli's very bones. The darkness within the fissure writhed and pulsed, a living void that reached up from the depths. Eli stepped forward, his hands trembling.
Mia, please.
He begged, his voice cracking.
I love you.
For a moment, everything stopped. The howling, the tremors, the pulsating light, it all paused, as though the ranch itself was listening. Mia's head jerked up, her eyes locking onto his. For a split second, the darkness receded, and he saw her. Really saw her. Her lips quivered, her eyes filling with a desperate, painful clarity.
Eli. I love you, too.
She whispered. And then, with a sudden, violent jolt, she was gone. The fissure swallowed her whole, the darkness dragging her down into the earth, the void closing around her like the jaws of a beast. Eli screamed, lunging forward, but it was too late. She was gone. The chamber collapsed in on itself, the symbols fading, the light extinguished. The ranch went silent. Eli stood there, staring at the spot where Mia had been. The silence was deafening, the weight of the loss suffocating him. He fell to his knees, his hands trembling, his breath ragged. Mia was gone. The ranch had taken her. The hunt was over. Or so he thought. Weeks later, Eli stood at the edge of the ranch, staring at the vast, barren landscape. The ranch was quiet now, its dark energy seemingly dormant. But Eli knew better. It was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the next victim. His heart ached with the weight of his failure. He hadn't saved her. The The woman he loved was lost to the darkness of the ranch, and he had no way of getting her back. But then, as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. In the distance, barely visible through the haze, was a figure. It stood motionless, watching him from the edge of the horizon. It was Mia, and she was smiling. For more chilling stories, like and subscribe.